Chapter 4.
So the next topic we want to look at is stroke, which perhaps is the second biggest killer and debilitating disorder that people can suffer from. It's divided really into two types. We're all familiar with the fact that when people get a stroke, they usually get a paralysis of one side of the body, usually on the opposite side of where the stroke is. It's not always 100% because some fibres are ipsilateral, although the majority motor fibres cross over to the other side. Most people get a stroke and paralyse the opposite side of the body to where the side where the stroke is. So there's two types. There's the hemorrhagic stroke, that means a bleed, and there's the ischemic one, which is the blockage. And that usually is blockage from a clot. So let's deal with the hemorrhagic one first. A hemorrhagic one means a burst. Okay? And a burst means that the blood vessel is weakened. And obviously people with a high blood pressure and a weakened artery system are going to be more prone to this. Okay? So hence the reason why we try to keep blood pressure to within normal limits. So very high blood pressure over a period of time will lead towards a stroke if in a weakened type of person. Therefore, keep the blood pressure under control, and the second most important thing is to keep the elasticity in the arteries. Okay? So to prevent obviously the arteries from furring up, but most important here from the hemorrhagic one is collagen. So people suffer from little bursts very frequently, and we see this a lot with patients, and we talked about this before, are these little blood spots that you see on people's bodies. Okay? Now sometimes you see one on a tummy somewhere, sometimes people have got lots of them all over, but we've all seen them, and you can stick an acupuncture needle into them and just get rid of them, you know. But they come back, of course, because you haven't solved the problem. That is the first sign of an aneurysm. An aneurysm is a bulge. So it's not a burst, it's a bulge. And when they burst, then you get a blood clot. So when you see these little red ones on the skin, you're actually really looking at the brain. We don't put enough emphasis on the skin being a mirror reflection of the brain. But it's all ectodermal tissue, embryologically. Both the brain and the skin come from the same cells. So it means that they're intimately connected all their life. So when you see a problem on the skin, you're usually looking at a problem on the surface of every cell, the cell membrane, and the brain. Okay? So when you see a little burst here, you may potentially get one in the brain. You may have plenty of them in the brain and not be in a place where you use or notice any problem. But on the other hand, you may occur in the basal ganglion or motor cortex or somewhere and have a devastating effect. So hemorrhagic stroke is a burst. And therefore you need to consider everything related to homocysteine, which is what weakens blood vessels. As has been shown, it inhibits collagen formation, and as a result of inhibiting collagen, the glue literally doesn't hold us together enough. So could I use you again? Yes. So the best way to test for collagen is to just do the stretch test. Now you can stretch the skin. The skin contains all the different forms of collagen, and including those that are in the joints and in the brain tissue and in the muscles. So pull the knee towards the shoulder, and what he's going to do is he's just going to tug the skin on the back of the hand, and it's a tug. Okay, so we demonstrated that before. So you tug it, pull it, and hold it. Okay, and pull the knee up, and then you can do it on the face. Just give a tug on the skin on the face, and he remains nice and strong. Okay, so that's fine. Yeah. So if a person goes weak to the tug test, then they've probably got a collagen problem. And you can cross-check this with a simulated copy vial of collagen, and as we'll see a little bit later on with arthritis, there's 5 different types of collagen that we test for, and you can actually identify which type of collagen it is. But it's a tug, and it's a pull on the skin. Okay? If we let that skin go, which again we'll do a little bit later, it's the recoil, and that's elastin. Okay? So the tug is for collagen, and the recoil is for elastin. Okay? So those are the two main extracellular components. So hemorrhagic stroke, this is typically of high homocysteine. So which person is going to get this? Is the red person, isn't it? So you look at the red factors here, you've got to get rid of homocysteine, haven't you? You've got to metabolize it down to cysteine. Therefore, you need the B6 or pyridoxal 5-phosphate, vitamin C. So these are people who need perhaps vitamin C here, and methylcobalamin and the folates. So it all fits into a package, and you'll see that these are the nutrients that red people need. So they need B6, they need B12, they need folates, etc. The second type of stroke is the ischemic stroke. In other words, the lack of oxygen to the tissue, and this can be more devastating than the hemorrhagic, because what happens is we build up a lack of oxygen in the area, and we know that the brain tissue needs lots of oxygen. Therefore, the damage in an ischemic area is far greater than often a hemorrhagic stroke. So here we need to actually be able to work in the same protocol as arteriosclerosis. So we need to get the circulation widened up here. So we look for the omega-3 plant oils with this one. And the omega-3 plant oils really are your flaxseed or linseed, as we'll see later, your walnut and your pumpkin. Okay, those are the three. So these are the three oils that you'll find that blue people need. So omega-3 plant oils. And what they will do is to thin the blood and stop the platelets from clumping together, so you'll decrease the risk of then having a thrombotic clogging up of the ischemic arteries. So look for the things that break those clots down anyway, which is magnesium, ginger, garlic, to stimulate the prostacyclins. Okay, we didn't put onion in there. There should be onion as well in there. So that's your two types of strokes. I find strokes, patients respond very well to physical treatment. They have to do it over a period of time, of course. And the key to working with a stroke is to work distal to proximal. You don't start off doing all the proximal things. You wiggle the toe around and articulate the toe and work your way back up towards the brain. So gently stimulating and getting the brain to fire much more on that particular side. And with the right nutrients there for the tissue repair, you can begin to make some good progress. So some people make complete recoveries, and other people you only get to a certain area because of the amount of damage that's done. But they're very grateful, because usually these people are given physiotherapy for a few weeks and then told to go away and told, well, the progress you'll make will be up to about a year, and then you won't make any more progress from there, which isn't true. I can pick people up after 2 or 3 years and still improve them, but not necessarily be able to get them right back, which is what one would like to. Right, now cancer is a totally different issue that we're talking about. We've left the cardiovascular sort of problems out. Cancer is probably more of a result of a problem, again, when you get uncontrolled cellular growth. So you've basically got immature cells which haven't been specialized into functional cells. So really they're stem cells, okay, which are growing out of control. And therefore, eventually they would cause occlusion of blood vessels and so on. So people die from the effect of the growth rather than the growth itself. So it's the effect of the growth. Now those cells are immature, and one thing which is universal to every cancer cell, as far as I'm aware, is that they are anaerobic. They are not aerobic. Okay, they're anaerobic, so they don't have mitochondrial function, so they're not producing energy in the right pathway. So they're functioning anaerobically, which means that the person or the cell in the mitochondria can't change pyruvate into the Krebs cycle to acetone and spin it and make it aerobic. So the one thing that they are all short of universally is oxygen. So they're starved of oxygen. That doesn't mean the person is starved of oxygen, but the tissue is. Jenny was talking about a little while ago when we used the impedance scan, an electrical one, which put an electric current through the tissues in the hands, feet and the face, and then did a mapping of the various tissues in the body. And the one thing that surprised me was how universal hypoxia was. Almost every person, you could guarantee there was an area in their body which was hypoxic. Not all of them, but areas of the brain, etc., which were lacking oxygen. It's a big, big problem, and it's one which, is really a cardinal etiology, if you like, to many, many problems. So hypoxia is definitely common to some extent, certainly with all the cancer cells. So these people lack oxygen, and that means they usually lack B12 and or iron. Okay? They are always the blue. Okay, I have never yet found a red or green person who's had a malignancy, but remember, it's not the other way around. Doesn't mean that all blue people have a malignancy or will even get a malignancy, any more than all red people will have a heart attack. Okay? It's just that you're genetically a little bit more prone towards those enzymes and body functions not working as well, which could predispose you to it. Doesn't mean you will. But you can make great modifications, and that's the important thing, to lifestyle. They all weaken to the D form of lactic acid. Now, I don't know why. I can understand them weakening to lactic acid, but it's not the L or the DL form, it's always the D, and there must be a significance to this. Now, I showed you earlier the D form of lactic acid comes off from pyruvate. If you don't change pyruvate into acetyl-CoA in the mitochondrial membrane, it shunts it then sideways into making the lactic acid. And lactic acid can have a right or a left and right form. And it's the right form, the dextro one, which seems to weaken in all cases of cancer. So in other words, there's a build-up of lactic acid, presumably in the tissue, in the cancerous tissue. They therefore have low acetyl-CoA because they're not converting pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. That means they don't make the acetyl group to make acetylcholine. Okay, so what significance is that, you say, apart from the fact you might go a bit gaga because your memory recoil is acetylcholine and your neuromuscular junctions are all acetylcholine, which means these people get weak and they go, strange in the head. But more important than that is that they show to one particular meridian. When we do the meridian study later on in the practice with using the digital computer diagnostics and the acetates, is you will see they all show to the gallbladder meridian. Now, the gallbladder meridian we know is associated with the emotion or negative emotion of guilt and blame, which is for self-punishment, in other words. And this can project when people have guilt and blame. They often project this onto other people, and it expresses itself as anger. So they often, have internal aggression or sometimes even external aggression towards other people. But guilt and blame is like a self-punishment. It's a self-flagellation. So guilt and blame equates, we know, with the gallbladder meridian, okay? And the gallbladder meridian equates with low levels of acetylcholine, okay? Now, acetylcholine may have a much more fundamental role with these cancer cases over and above the neuromuscular junctions and the memory. It could be that it affects the immune system. So in other words, the cells that are necessary to kill cancer cells, which are generally considered to be natural killer cells, may be stimulated or regulated in the body by acetylcholine. We know that all brain chemicals not only affect nerve to nerve, but actually go into the circulation and affect cell membranes on their receptors. So they are floating brains. Every cell has receptors for all the neuropeptides in the brain. Okay? So even including our immune system. We've known for a long time that all immune system cells have serotonin receptors on them. So when your serotonin is low, you feel low, but so does your immune system. Okay? So we know that there's different white cells for the immune system. We've got all sorts of lymphocytes, basophils, eosinophils, we've got the lymphocytes and so on. And we're going to do a module, maybe the one in February, March time, which will be a suitable time on infections and the immune system. And it would be really, really nice to be able to tie in those brain chemicals and, of course, the emotions associated with infectious diseases. So it may well be that we can see that guilt and blame equates with low levels neurochemically of acetylcholine, which equates with low levels of natural killer cells. Okay? So for the blue person, this is really important. For the rest of us, we can live with our guilt and blame. But it would be nice to know the emotion for a heart attack, wouldn't it? Because we were talking at coffee time that Michael Allen, my friend in the States, has just written a wonderful book on what your brain would say if it could talk. And we're going to put it onto our website when it's available fairly soon. And he's maintained, when he came over and gave us a couple of sessions a few years ago, that heart attacks start in the brain. And I thought about that. He's talking neurologically that there's changes in the brain, and by adjusting various spinal points, you could make the muscles, the subscapularis, go strong and so on. And so he sees it as a neurological problem. But we now could take that to the next stage and say, yeah, it may be neurological, in which case there's this particular neurochemical, but we could take it now to the emotion. And we will find, and this is what you will work out in the field, is that see if everybody who's had a myocardial infarct shows the same emotion. Wouldn't that be fascinating to know then the person that you could predict, a red person with a particular emotion of, maybe the one to look for the heart problems. You never know what the emotion is with the person from looking at them, talking with them. You have no idea what's going on in a person's mind. And most of all, you have no idea what's going on in your own mind. You don't even know what's, how you're thinking without knowing it, trying to understand how somebody else is. Now, another observation I've made, and I'm sure this is written about because other people must have found it, is they all have sleep disturbances. They have poor sleep, and they'll tell you as soon as they're diagnosed, and that's enough to make anybody have sleep problems, but they have sleep problems. Even when they've had treatment and been so-called clear, is they still have sleep disturbances, and they all strengthen to melatonin, but not everyone. Okay? So a lack of melatonin is not the cause, but some people do say, that melatonin does have anti-malignancy effects. So it could be that there is this relationship of the melatonin, and we do know that people who travel a lot jet-wise, like airline hostesses, have a much greater incidence of breast cancer than other girls. Okay, and it could therefore be because their body clock system with their melatonin is out of sync. And of course we now live in a world where we don't get enough rest in the wintertime because we stay up to 11 o'clock at night still. Whereas biologically we should have gone to bed, when it gets dark. And so maybe we don't have long enough periods of melatonin exposure. So melatonin is produced when it's nighttime, when it's dark, and it peaks at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then slowly drops down to a resting level at 5 o'clock in the morning. So sometime after 5 you should naturally wake up when you're ready to. If you wake up any time really between going to bed or when you fall asleep and 5 o'clock, then there's an abnormal level usually of melatonin. And that may be around a particular time, like at the moment 2 till 4 in the morning, a lot of very popular time, and that's always liver time, isn't it? Biologically is liver time. So the liver is working hard to break toxins down while you're asleep, and as it's doing that, it's breaking melatonin down, and so you wake up. Okay. So guilt and blame, sleep problems, okay? And then finally here, and this again is the bit which we want to get to with the genetics, is there is a methylation defect. And basically what this means is there's a lack of methyl groups, okay? So a person who gets to 50, as I said, and suddenly develops a breast cancer or a prostate cancer, whatever it might be, and it's well, this is genetic or whatever, maybe that the gene has been exposed. That's, you've kept it quiet for all those years. If you had the gene and it's expressing itself, you would be dead with the problem many years before, wouldn't you? Okay, why wait till 50 or 60 or 70? What is it that's allowed that gene to express itself? And what we'll see is the gene itself is covered with protein. And this is really interesting, and I'll describe it in a bit more detail, how the protein sleeve is pulled away and expresses the gene. Okay. So methylation defects. And what is the name of the universal methyl donor is S-adenosylmethionine. Okay? So these people will strengthen to SAM as a coenzyme. Okay? Now, it may be that you can make SAM from methionine, but most people are not short of methionine, but that you may need to look at the cofactors and coenzymes involved with making the conversion of methionine into SAM, that adenosyl transferase enzyme, which needs ATP. So this brings you back to the energy, and things like the vitamin Bs again and magnesium are all important in making ATP. So look for methylation defects by does the patient strengthen to SAM. So now I've given you a few clues. It does not mean that a blue person who weakens to lactic acid, strengthens to B12, etc., shows to the gallbladder meridian, doesn't sleep very well and strengthens to SAM, has got cancer. but I more or less guarantee every cancer case has got that pattern. So these are all things that can be changed in a person by epigenetic intervention. We can treat all of these. We can make sure that the pathway between pyruvate and acetyl-CoA opens up and gets to work well. We can relieve the hypoxia by looking at the B12, the oxygenation pathway iron. We can treat them for their guilt and blame, which we'll do this afternoon. And we can stimulate and look at the pathway of converting serotonin into melatonin to help them with their sleep. And we can increase their SAM and recycling the SAM with the right nutritional intervention. So we can do an awful lot about that to helping a person. But it's better, obviously, before the person gets the diagnosis to prevent them from getting it, put them back into their better state of health. Okay, right, so that's cancer. We'll come back to it because we'll build a profile up. I don't want to spend the whole day just talking about one disease. I want you to be able to put it into perspective because we don't treat diseases. We treat patients, don't we? Sometimes we make a diagnosis, but then what Dr. Goodhart always taught us is make your diagnosis and then put it to one side and get on with your work. Treat the patient, okay? We want to treat the patient. We want to see the context rather than the contents. So in other words, you've been diagnosed with diabetes type 1, so what? Okay? You're a patient. We want to treat you. We want to find out what your needs are. So diabetes is one of the, or considered to be the fastest growing disease all over the world. And there might be a reason for this. So type 1 diabetes and type 2 are very different. Type 1 basically is a failure to produce enough insulin from the pancreas. Now something I didn't know, and I was quite surprised, is there's another organ in the body that produces more insulin than the pancreas. And it's the brain. The brain has literally thousands and thousands of receptors for insulin, and it produces it, and nobody knows why. So again, it may be that diabetes starts in the brain, as a problem in the brain. If they can only move the insulin from the brain to the rest of the tissues, it might begin to work. And this is the problem with this, is that the pancreas has been shown to atrophy, particularly the Ehlers-Danlos cells. But it may be that you've got to get to the cause of why that pancreas has been affected. And they know that there are certain predisposing factors. We were talking about the build-up of antibodies against the thyroid from gluten. Alan was talking about that. So people may develop antibodies to gluten, and the gluten is very similar to the thyroglobulin proteins, and those antibodies may attack the thyroid from the gluten that the people are eating, which is why red people shouldn't eat too much wheat, okay? And it could be with the diabetics the same thing. Something that they're eating is affecting the antibodies, which in turn is then attacking the Ehlers-Danlos. And the thing that they found with this most commonly, the sensitivity, is milk. So milk as a substance has a particular chain on it which is very similar to the structure in the Ehlers-Danlos. And the theory is it's the milk protein, which is the casein, may trigger an immune response in certain people, and that immune response attacks the pancreas. Okay? This is, again, these are theories. Theories are great, aren't they? And they're the theory for this year, and then everybody teaches it, and then 5 years' time they find some other reason. So we say that's the theory. But you will find these people are a little bit more sensitive to dairy. So insulin is a very complex molecule. It's a protein, and it's a very long chain protein here, as we can see coiled around. And the pro-insulin molecule, in other words the precursor to it, is linked together or bonded together with sulfur. So sulfur is a really important part of the structure of the insulin molecule. Insulin is a polypeptide consisting of two chains linked by the sulfide bridges. Zinc is present in high concentrations in the beta cells of the pancreas and forms complexes within insulin and proinsulin. So this gives you the first clue, okay, as to what type of people will get this. So one thing is for sure is they're all zinc deficient. And we'll see when we come particularly to type 2 is that possibly people will have normal levels of insulin, maybe even high levels of insulin in type 2, but it doesn't work. is like a dummy. Okay, and if the zinc is there for a reason, it's present in high concentrations in the B cells, pancreas, and form complexes with insulin. That zinc deficiency may predispose to this, or that diabetics have chronic zinc deficiency. The phenylalanine tyrosine parts each form dimers containing specific atoms of zinc respectively. So within the chain, the amino acid chain, there's a lot of zinc. We won't go into all this. Hormonal factors. Adrenaline inhibits insulin release. Cortisol, estrogens, progesterones, growth hormone, placental lactogen all increase. Yeah, and this is insulin is known, secretion is higher in the latter stages of pregnancy. So things to consider: zinc. Now, I'm not sure whether this is just my observation, because I don't come across very many type 1s. Type 1s is a young person's disease. It's very unusual to become a type 1 diabetic as an adult. It's more of something in either youngsters or teenagers. And we know that teenagers and youngsters need a lot more nutrients in the way of minerals because they're growing than adults. So certainly zinc. And my observation there, and I think I've read it in books, is manganese has a role in here as well. But manganese is a trace element. Whether it has a role within the insulin itself, I'm not sure, but always test for manganese with that. Whether it replaces zinc, it can replace zinc, or whether it's a cofactor in the enzyme, in the hormone or not, I don't know. So test for manganese and test for sulfur, because this forms the bonds, all right? And everybody knows also with type 1 very much that they have inflammation, and that inflammation creates leukotrienes. So it's possible that when we look at inflammation, the mediators of inflammation can be substances called prostaglandins, particularly prostaglandins 2, but the body has a choice of making prostaglandins 2 or leukotrienes. And leukotrienes are far more inflammatory, thousands of times more inflammatory than prostaglandins 2, and they find high levels of leukotrienes in diabetics, type 1 diabetics. When the islets of Langerhans have been destroyed, they always find they have high levels of leukotriene B4, which is the most inflammatory one. Now, my experience with people with leukotrienes, high levels, is there's two causes. One is parasites, and the other one is allergy, which brings us back to the fact it's something that the people are eating, which is setting up the inflammation, which is increasing the leukotrienes, which does the damage to the pancreas. And anti-inflammatories for this, the best anti-inflammatories are the omega-3, sometimes the omega-6, but it's usually the omega-3 oils are the best antidote to the leukotrienes. So here you might consider fish oil, or preferably, because some of these people might be blue, is plant oils. Okay, so remember the three omega-3 ones: pumpkin seed, walnut, and flax. Maybe hemp as well. Hemp is a good one as well. So I forgot on those three omega-3s that hemp is 1/3 omega-3. Okay. So that would be your type 1. You probably won't, you may never see one. You know, I don't know whether there is prevalent, but the number of people I come across, occasionally you get a type 1 diabetic, but it's not common. But type 2 is. Now type 2, many of your patients might be type 2 and they don't know either, okay? And it would only be by chance that they had a urine test or a blood test on a routine screening that they may detect this. But that their blood sugar level was high and their urinary excretion was high of glucose. So it could be just on passing. Now the difference between type 2 and type 1 is that type 2 is an adult onset, that's the first thing, and it's associated with insulin resistance. So the insulin they produce is normal from the pancreas, but it doesn't work. Okay, it's like firing dummies. Okay, and there's obviously varying degrees of dumminess. In other words, it doesn't send out nil, otherwise they go completely into diabetic coma, but they decrease gradually the effectivity of the insulin. So the theory is, well, they produce insulin and it doesn't get across the cell membrane into the cell to do its job. That may be one reason. So you need to look at the oils to spice up the cell membranes to make them more mineral, so that things can diffuse across them. Or which is more likely, is that the insulin itself hasn't got the right cofactors to get it to work. Okay? Now we know what one of those major cofactors, or two of those now, is zinc, isn't it? So zinc is the big clue here to insulin resistance. It's a sign of chronic zinc deficiency. Maybe many other factors, but so 90% of diabetics have non-insulin dependent. So these people are going to, in fact, have high insulin often. So when the body has glucose increases like type 1, you need more insulin to drive that insulin into the cell to get it to use for energy. And what you can't drive into the cell, you'd make into fat. Okay? So typically, the blood sugar level goes up, and so the person becomes fat, okay, because they're just storing everything as fat. Now, there's another reason here that you might pick this up, and I picked this up years ago, is patients who are obviously gaining weight, potentially could have a problem there, but the major thing is they don't heal. They don't get right. It takes 10 times longer to get that back right, or their problem. They just don't heal. Now, in a minute, when we look at the genetics, there is one nutrient that is involved with the healing process, and that enzyme is called DNA polymerase, which is a zinc-dependent enzyme. Okay? So this brings you back to zinc again. Okay, if the person has zinc deficiency, okay, they will have a chronic problem with healing because they won't be able to activate DNA polymerase. Okay? Now, if they're zinc deficient, they then may not be able to get their enzyme to work, their insulin to work. And this is why it takes forever to heal. Okay? So anybody who doesn't heal, think potentially could be a type 2 diabetic, which is only a name. We're looking for the cause of that. But this could be because it doesn't start after a disease. It just starts slowly in most cases and then suddenly produces symptoms. Maybe is a chronic deficiency or something. Okay? If you've got a condition that comes on like that, then you think of something that comes on like that. Could be an infection. But it's not likely to be an infection if it comes on very slowly, is it? So what are the things that can make a person suffer any of these diseases is chronic deficiencies over a critical period. As say the zinc level gets here, they get a few symptoms, they get here, and then suddenly they get a big symptom. Okay? They get here, they got high homocysteine, no problems at all. And then they get down here, bang, they have a stroke. Okay? This is what happens. Sometimes people are remarkably okay. They notice no difference for many, many years and then turn it on. But the majority of people, it's a slow change when you become deficient. If you get an instant problem, then it's either an accident or an infection. Okay? Obviously, if you've got an infection, there's symptoms of an infection. You get a high temperature and all those sort of things. Okay? If you get skin reactions, it's probably something that you're eating, okay? Or a toxin coming out through the skin. Okay, remember the skin is a reflection of the brain. If you get things that get change, they get better, they get worse. Okay, they get better, particularly if they get completely better and then bad again. There's a variable here. This must be something that they're doing which varies, and that's usually what somebody's eating. Okay, that's the variation in most people's life is what they eat, isn't it? So if it gets better and gets worse, you know, for some reason, if they're consistently deficient, they're going to have a consistent problem. Okay, do you understand that? So you should be able to read, if you like, from the patient's symptoms and the history, a little bit into what the key things are. So the other thing that can cause severe problems is heavy metals or toxins, particularly when they get into strategic places like the brain. So we could say that probably most neurological problems, there's a toxin in there which is actually creating a killing effect, an inhibiting effect. But for the majority of people who just slowly degenerate, degenerative problems are deficiencies over long periods of time. We're the only people who understand this? I don't understand, you know. There's been medical people thinking about diseases for, you know, thousands of years, and the only person who's ever made any sense of that is Hippocrates, who said your food is your medicine. Isn't it? He knew that 2,000 years ago, but modern medicine doesn't seem to give any interest whatsoever in diet or nutrition, biochemistry as a cause. So type 2 diabetes are often obese, gain weight, have elevated blood insulin levels, and have high blood glucose. So these people weaken to insulin when you muscle test them, and they weaken to glucose. Okay? So functionally, a type 1 person strengthens to insulin because they're deficient and weakens to glucose. Okay? So this is the type 1. So type 1 will weaken to glucose because they're high glucose, and they will strengthen to insulin because they're deficient in insulin. All right? A type 2 will weaken to glucose, but weaken to insulin because you've got too high a insulin, but it doesn't work. Okay, so that's how we do it. So characteristics most common in adults, so we've said all that. Treatment usually begins with diet and exercise, just to really regulate the blood glucose going in through their food. So weight loss, changes in diet, increased exercise. These are the usual things that they suggest first of all. So there can be severe complications, and this is interesting, that there are certain receptors, certain cells in the body that don't have insulin receptors. One of these is the kidney. Okay? One of them is the neurological system, particularly the eye. Okay, so you can get kidney complications, you can get neurological, you potentially can get blindness there. Okay, now there's another one, an interesting one from a clinical observation, and that is the shoulder joint. I didn't know this, but a patient years ago presented to me with a frozen shoulder, and this was the second one she'd had. And I said, well, this is really interesting. And she was a type 1 diabetic, quite a rare case for me. And I said, I just wondered out of interest, whether diabetics tend to get frozen shoulders. And she said, oh, it's all over the clinic, the diabetic clinic. These are one of the common symptoms, one of the areas which is resistant. So frozen shoulders may be an indication of a type diabetes. Could be type 2, because they usually come on around sort of 45 to 60, 65, don't they, frozen shoulders. Rarely do you get them younger than that, and rarely older, but that's also the time when type 2 diabetes tend to come on. Frozen shoulders take forever to get better, don't they? They're real pains. Most of them do. Some of them never get better, but most of them do respond, and not many people actually treat them during the different stages. I don't mind, but the patient has to understand it's going to take months rather than weeks. And again, they just, because they're so slow at healing, would fit with that chronic zinc deficiency and perhaps the tendency towards diabetes type 2. So test them particularly for high insulin and high glucose. So what they get up is a build-up of sorbitol in the membrane, or glycosylation as it's called. And then you build up antibodies against those glycosylated proteins in the shoulder joint, in the fibrous capsule, which sets up the inflammation. So always think of a type 2 diabetic. The diabetic clinics know this. It's just a pity that everybody else doesn't know. What they know is that frozen shoulders are a symptom of diabetes, along with loss of vision, of course, and kidney damage. Treatment. So what would we look for? This is type 2, remember, okay? Now the classical ones there is chromium, because this helps to stimulate something called the glucose tolerance factor, which not much is ever written about, but test the people for chromium. Some people find, a lot of people show the chromium. When I was teaching in Russia last week, one of the girls presenting a seminar had done hair samples from the area, which was just this side of the Urals. And she presented this paper on something like 98% of the population had chronic mineral deficiencies. Chronic, And they were all our friends. Calcium was in there, surprisingly, because we never find calcium deficiency usually here, or very seldom, because of the hard water and things. But again, the water was very soft there, which may have been one of the reasons. Magnesium was hideously deficient. Boron was hideously deficient. All the trace minerals, zinc, of course, was there. But chromium was there, and they measured the chromium, and she was talking about glucose tolerance factor. It was chronically deficient, and diabetes is quite a big problem over there. So on the opposite side was the toxins that they measured there, and these, remember, are in a reasonable rural area with not too much industry around the whole area. That silica was very high. Interesting. Silica was actually considered to be toxic. Strontium was very toxic. Okay. Now, no guesses why. Okay. This is Russia, remember. Okay. And she said the danger of strontium. And I said, oh, interesting that it was high. She said, yeah, it's deadly. She said, on bone density. And what are they now prescribing for bone density problems is strontium, isn't it? Strontium is considered to be a vital nutrient, and they're now prescribing it for bone density problems when it's low. And I said to her, in Europe and America, I know they prescribe strontium for bone density problems, for osteoporosis. So it's one of those which too much can be toxic and too little may have a benefit, a bit like boron and so on. And then they had mercury and they had cadmium and all the usual sort of things. And I said, well, why is it so high in all these toxic oils? And she said it was all military. She said it was the military have done it all. So, you know, all the area there is toxic because of military. It was all secret during the Cold War time. The whole area there was done for military. And they polluted like mad. You know, they produced armaments and toxins and things, and just it's rained and it spread it all over the soil. And then that's got into the food chain and then gets into the people. Okay? So, and they were devils for, in the Stalin years, of growing the same crop on the same soil year after year after year. The great steppes, as they were called, between Moscow down to the Black Sea, became barren. Dr. Schaefer and myself went there by coach quite a few years ago, and it was just tragic to see this barren land with just the odd watermelon growing on it. It just wouldn't grow anything else because it was totally depleted. And that's why the minerals were so low there, but the toxins are also so high. And it's fearful that we might be doing the same, you know, in this country, of growing the same crops. You see oilseed rape, don't you, in the same soil year after year after year. And they replace the phosphates and things like that, but they don't put the zinc and the chromiums and those important trace minerals, the manganese levels and so on. So chromium has an important role, manganese, as we know, and zinc, of course, are part of the insulin molecule there. There used to be include there vanadium as well, but vanadium was sort of moved sideways by the EU about 3 years ago, if you remember, was not allowed to be prescribed as a mineral for human consumption. Okay, Vanadium sulfate, I think, Vanadium sulfate we used to do, and Vancro zinc as a product. And some people liked it very much, and it has been shown, like chromium, to regulate blood sugar levels. But the spice that really works well and is written an awful lot about for getting blood sugar under control is cinnamon. So cinnamon is ideal for type 2 diabetics, and cinnamon should be used as a tincture, ideally, or added to the food on a regular basis for anybody who's got a tendency towards type 2 diabetes. So, you know, many of these spices, I think, work by increasing, particularly the heating spices, increasing the metabolic rate, increasing enzyme functions. So they act as what we call allosteric effectors. They zap the enzyme up. And some of those enzymes, like the cytochrome P450 detoxifications, can be stimulated by certain spices. But clearly here, whether it's the insulin which works better, nobody knows, but they do know that blood sugar gets under better control with the use of cinnamon in the diet.
End of chapter 4.